Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Daniel, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, sure. I'm Dan Czitrom, recently retired from teaching at Mount Holyoke College for 40 years. I'm an historian of the United States and with a focus on New York City. And my recent book, New York Exposed, first came about after I was wandering around a used bookstore, and I came across this 5-volume set that just had investigation of the New York Police Department. And I thought, wow, this looks interesting. And it turned out to be the court stenographic account of a sensational investigation of the NYPD that took place in 1894, known as the Lexow Committee, which was a committee appointed by the State Senate of New York. Now, of course, I knew a bit about the Lexow investigation, but here before me, and I bought this thing, I took it home. Here was, 5,000 pages, 6,000 pages of testimony. And of course, that's a stenographic account. That doesn't give you the real, history, politics, the figures, the personalities. But I began with that stenographic account, and I took a deep dive into New York of the 1890s. To try to understand the police department and why the Lexow investigation was such a huge deal. This was really the first sensational political investigation, partly because the media world in New York City in the 1890s had kind of exploded. You had a dozen or more English language newspapers, not to mention the ethnic press. And there was a tremendous amount of coverage of this investigation. And what it did ultimately was sort of blow the roof off of New York politics and the New York Police Department, and exposed really for the first time practices that had been going on for many years. And it had a particularly political resonance, and that's because in those days, New York State was the center of American politics. New York State had 36 electoral votes. You needed 201 to win. And so whichever party, Democrats or Republicans, controlled New York State, very often would control the presidency. And the battle over New York City, of course, was a crucial part of this because New York City had become so big. And in a nutshell, the NYPD, the police department, in that point in our history, the Bureau of Elections was under the purview, under the control of the police department. So the police department had a very, very political role, and American police departments have been political ever since the very beginning. At any rate, what the Lexow investigation did was it started out as a investigation into alleged vote fraud. The committee was controlled by Republicans, and then it morphed into something else as they dug deeper and deeper into the workings of the NYPD. So anyway, it's a very juicy story, and one that I think tells us a lot, not only about Gilded Age New York, but about some of the themes that continue to be central to contemporary culture and politics.
Now, I know about political cartoons. I know about like little propaganda, either striking a stone and a Rockefeller type individual. But was the public aware that there was an exceeding amount of corruption going on back then? I mean,
Oh, sure. I mean, in the tenements and in the streets, and I mean, everybody understood that the police had enormous power, and and back in those days, a police captain of a particular neighborhood was like was like a little emperor that had an enormous amount of power. And what emerges, among other things, is that the police had become the managers of what I call the vice economy. New York City in the Gilded Age, I'm talking about prostitution, the saloon trade, counterfeiting, gambling. All these things, were big business in the city, and in effect, the cops were the managers of these things because they were intimately involved. Certainly in gambling, the prostitution trade, the liquor trade, and on and on. Um, and one of the questions people always ask me is, well, what about the elite of New York? What about the people who, control real estate and banks, the Chamber of Commerce types and all that? Weren't they, sort of concerned about this? And the brief answer that I always give is this: that essentially, the economic and commercial elite of New York in those days didn't really care that much about the cops taking money, protecting prostitutes, benefiting from the vice economy in various ways. They didn't really care that much about that as long as the cops kept their boot on the neck of the labor movement, radicals, other, sort of social and political activists of the time. And so the police department is not only the manager of the vice economy in this era, but it also acts as a kind of check, if you will, against labor organizers, socialists, anarchists, radicals, and particularly when you have the Great Depression of 1893, which was the worst depression in American history until the 30s. A lot of people were suffering. A lot of people were very, very tough shape. And there was a lot of protests. There was the emergence of a socialist movement, strong labor movement, and big capital didn't like that at all. So the cops are basically the enforcers in some ways of the social order. And that means, for example, using the police to help break strikes, using the police as spies on unions, and so on. So the Lexile investigation of 1894 really sort of brings all this stuff to the fore. And one of the other big issues, of course, was police brutality, which is very much still with us. Now you got to remember, back in those days, there's no cameras, there's no TV, there's no recording of what cops are doing. They have a tremendous amount of power and freedom to do what they want. One of the things that the Lexile investigation revealed very, very graphically was the widespread reality of police brutality, not only against poor people and recent immigrants, Italians, Jews, uh, they bore the brunt of things, but also police brutality against middle class and respectable citizens. And one of the things that comes out, and again, I think there's an interesting parallel with today, is that it was extremely difficult to ever convict or punish policemen for breaking the law, whether it was beating the hell out of somebody on the street or other forms of oppression. Uh, the district attorneys and the prosecutors were very, very loath to try to prosecute cops because they work with them every day, and because the police were considered to be sort of the wall against anarchy, so to speak. And I think this is a problem today that continues. There's no job culture that's tighter than police. What I mean by that is that the loyalty to other police is extreme. We have what we call the blue wall of silence, largely the widespread refusal of police to testify against other cops. It's a big problem.
Well, it's like the unwritten code because it's just like dealing if you get fast food or something, if you yell at the person who's making your food, they're probably going more likely going to spit in it, even though there's ramifications to that. But it's just the aspect of getting away with it. And that's with police. I mean, we look at them as a shield for us or being able to call them whenever we need it. But also, I mean, police respect today is so low because of the fact that there are a lot of issues with corruption that goes in a lot of these police departments. Maybe not so much going on with prostitution, but more with police brutality, things that happen to get away. But I feel like the media does a good job at trying to expose some of that. It's weird. They kind of choose and pick a little bit as well, too.
Well, I think the big difference is that it's racialized today. I mean, today most police brutality involves, like in George Floyd's case and many other similar cases, it involves, essentially a white police force taking it out on blacks, Latinos, other minorities. But I think that look, I'm not a defund the police person. I'm not a person that believes in abolishing the police. We need cops. And when people start telling me that we need to defund the police and abolish police department, my first question is always, well, where do you live? Because the idea that you don't need police, I think, is kind of
I live close to Baltimore, so trust me, we need police, but it's just about serving a proper code. I feel like we
sure,
trying to
sure,
find
sure.
the
And
corruption.
one of the problems historically with American police, not just New York, is this: that I mean, when New York City first established a professional police department in the mid 1840s, how did you get on the police force? Well, you were appointed by the local alderman, and there was a political reality to policing from the very beginning. By contrast, let's say if you look at Great Britain, which starts its police force, I think, in London about 1830. There was a national police force. I mean, you were trained nationally, and there were certain standards that were insisted upon. Whereas in America, and this is part of our sort of history, we have the obsession with local control, and also the fear of standing armies. The suspicion that you don't want to have a police force as an occupying army. The bottom line is that today we now have, I think it's about 19,000 separate police forces in the United States. And when people talk about reform, can we make it better? If you break that down into local communities, it's extremely difficult to create any kind of national policy, right, that's going to be implemented and going to be effective because um, cops are controlled locally. And you're not going to be able to impose, these standards on all these police forces.
Now, I'm going to take it back a little bit to early New York. Were some of these giant, political figures or people funding the police department? Because I know you kind of mentioned, like, looking at, I guess, a different direction if something was going on. Kind of, it's a you scratch my back, I scratch your back type situation. You want to be good with the cops, and the cops will treat you whatever. You can probably get some things across. But I just wonder if any of them were funding any of those police departments. So I feel like that would sway you maybe not to pull somebody over, or maybe not to look into some of the corruption aspects when it comes to prostitution, gambling, and other illegal activities.
Right. Well, like I said, I mean, the political thing was extremely important because in New York, after the Civil War, the Bureau of Elections was under the purview, under the control of the police department. And it turns out that the police department, was a source of patronage, and it was a source of power. I'll give you an example. One of the things that comes out in the investigation is that, um, to be promoted to police captain, there were about 30 captains, 30 different police districts in New York, say in the 1890s. And if you wanted to be promoted to captain, you had to basically come up with a chunk of cash. It turned out to be $15,000. Most cops could not afford that, so they would gather backers, people in the neighborhood, people who owned real estate, bankers, people who owned theaters, saloons, and so on. And you basically had to bribe the police commissioners in order to get appointed as captain. There was a lot of that going on. Now, one of the myths is that the police department is controlled by Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine. And in fact, the police captains in New York at that time were pretty much evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. And this again is one of the things I think that really, if you leap forward to our era, you can see real sort of interesting connections. The fact that the police department back then is highly politicized has to do with the central role, as I suggested before, of New York State and New York City in national politics. You got to imagine a time when New York State was the big state. I mean, if you look at presidential elections from the Civil War, from let's say Lincoln to World War II, FDR, you will find a New Yorker on every presidential ticket in every election because, as I said, New York State, 36 electoral votes, you only need 201 to win. So, again, just by example, in 1884, Grover Cleveland was elected president, first Democratic president since the Civil War. One of only two Democratic presidents elected between the Civil War and the Great Depression. He carried New York State by 1,100 votes out of millions cast, and so that thin margin gave Grover Cleveland New York State. He was elected president, reelected again in 1892. So the point I'm trying to make here is that is that the political stakes were extremely high. And since in New York, and since the police department oversaw elections, you can see that it was a highly politicized situation. Um, and so, no, I think that now, as back then, we have two parties that are very, very closely contested. Two parties are very close. The elections are closely contested. Um, as now as back then, we sometimes would see the disconnect between the popular vote and the electoral vote, right? I mean, Trump gets elected in 2016. He doesn't win the popular vote, he wins the electoral vote. That happened several times in the Gilded Age. People often wonder about this. How does that happen? Well, the United States is the only country in the world that has the term popular vote. Everywhere else is just the vote. Because of the electoral college system, as you know, I'm sure it's more complicated than just winning the popular vote. The larger point here is that a system in which you have two parties that are closely, matched, a system where you have the winner take all approach to politics, that is, whoever wins 50% plus one is elected to the Congress or to the Senate or whatever. Um, in that situation, you have a tremendous incentive to cheat, to try to keep the other people from voting, to try to make sure your votes get counted. And you know, in the 1890s, as today, there is a deep suspicion, even hatred of big cities in American politics. In the Gilded Age, Republicans did all they could to try to tamp down the vote in big cities like New York. They did this legally and illegally. Whenever the cry, you hear the cry of vote fraud, when people are claiming that there's fraudulent votes, you can be sure that vote suppression is really taking place. And again, I would point to the contemporary scene where, I don't think it was an accident that in 2020, the election deniers, Trump supporters, all these people who claim that the election was rigged, what cities and states are they attacking? Where are they claiming vote fraud is taking place? Well, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Detroit, cities that have large minority populations, cities that are heavily Democratic. Something similar was going on in the Gilded Age. The assumption that somehow by Republicans that cities are corrupt, that urban voters are uneducated, that they're voting illegally, they're not citizens. All this sort of stuff was part of the rhetoric. And I think you see it today in a sort of different sort of fashion, but it's the same basic idea. Cities are evil, cities are corrupt. The people who inhabit cities are less educated, less worthy of being citizens, more likely to be criminals, all this sort of stereotyping. And that's very much, that breaks down along partisan political lines. By the Gilded Age, by the 1890s, most American big cities were Democratic. Most American big cities had Democratic political machines. We hear endlessly about those. I mean, every American, knows about Boss Tweed and the Tammany Hall machine and vote corruption, vote fraud. But people usually don't think about the other side of that, which is the Republican Party machine. There were two machines in the Gilded Age, as there are today. The Democratic Party machine was rooted in cities, the urban working class, the immigrants, um, Catholics and Jews, and it was dependent upon urban patronage. People getting jobs through the city government, or people getting coal to get them through the hard winter, or people getting unemployment help when they needed a job. Getting your kid out of jail with the help of some local, a political guy. That is the Democratic machine. What about the Republican machine? Well, the Republican machine is based not in cities, but in small towns and rural areas. Its main adherents are small farmers, small business people, also African Americans who voted heavily Republican in the North and the South when they could vote. And of course, their patronage was based on the federal government, getting a job as a postmaster, Civil War pensions, which were a huge political issue in the late 19th century. So one of the things I try to argue is that, we've had generations of historians and especially journalists and political cartoonists who make it seem as if corruption is only on one side. In fact, corruption was all over the place. And again, like today, I'm one of those folks that believes that the Congress, the American political system, has become a form of legalized bribery, basically. You look at all the millions of dollars that are raised, given to candidates, run campaigns, and so on. I mean, the problem is not what's illegal. To me, the problem is what's legal. And these are very deep currents in American politics, and they have to do with the structure of American politics. The Gilded Age had its own version of this. I think today we have something that's, you really hear the echoes of this. As Mark Twain once said, history may not repeat itself, but it sure as hell rhymes. And, I think there's a lot of truth to that.
It's refreshing that you mentioned both sides are kind of open to corruption because I don't really fall on a side. I would say I'm more politically homeless. I just benefits of living in a deep state. I think we're tied with a capitalist system, and I think anybody who's motivated to make money is probably going to make decisions in less likely of your best interest just because to make a little bit more money. I don't think that's crazy to say, but I think both sides do that as well too. Now there are obviously big points you could put on each side to say which is which or who's differ, whatever. That aside, when it comes to the idea of influencing people and this idea of voter fraud or voter tampering, I mean, it's refreshing to know that like there was issues with that in the past because it might have been different methods, but I think there's a large amount of people are kind of consciously thinking about whatever decision that they're going to make, who's holding something over my head. And that gets into states, obviously, kind of boils down a little bit deeper than that when it comes into just propaganda and aspects. I mean, I live in Baltimore. It's the second most dangerous city in the world. It's proclaimed to be the second most dangerous city in the world. But they always point out either ethnic flaws or they point out a bunch of things and they don't just look at what are the people dealing with. Well, they're dealing with a lot of issues. Their economy kind of down there is crap, and it's probably crap like that in other places. They don't talk about core issues. They just blame it on this is why. You can see the correlation here, and the correlation really doesn't make much sense.
Well, again, to go back to the Gilded Age and talk about some structural realities, which are different than today. I mean, imagine yourself living in New York in 1890. Like most people, you're working class, you're trying to raise a family, you're trying to get your kids to school, whatever. There's no Social Security, there's no Medicare, there's no unemployment insurance, there's no welfare. There is no, we don't have in those years the kinds of entitlement programs. I hate that word. Let's use something else. We don't have the kind of social programs that came in with the New Deal and later that gave people a basic social safety net. Okay, so if you're that person in 1890 in New York or Baltimore, for that matter, or any big city, your kid is in trouble with the law. You've been unemployed for 6 months, let's say. There's a fire in your building and you're homeless. Who do you go to? See what I'm saying? You can't rely on the federal government, certainly. You can't rely on the state government. The only person you can go to is the local ward healer, the person who represents the political machine in your neighborhood. Maybe he can get your kid out of jail. Maybe he can get you a job on a construction site. Maybe he can get you coal to get through the winter, provide some kind of basic service. And the fundamental dynamic of these political machines is fairly simple. In exchange for limited services, right, you get the vote. And that's why, the main reason why these Democratic Party machines became so powerful, because they provided some, not to everybody, but some people, basic services that help people survive in a very, very gritty world of urban capitalism, where you have, a lot of unemployment, you have depressions. Life was tough in these big cities in the 1890s. And so, the machine is basically about providing some kind of service to people who need it. And that declines after World War II because of the emergence of the welfare state. On the other hand, wealthy people also are interested in using the state to benefit them. And I think that both Democrats and Republicans back then, and to a certain extent now, nobody will admit this, but they view politics as a business, right? If you're a Tammany Hall guy, I mean, you're out there every day checking out on the neighborhood, who needs help. People are coming to you all the time. You're in touch with people. That's how you're going to get reelected. But they treat it like a business. It's a job, right? And today it's a little different, but you still have this what I would call election industry, which is not just the elections, but all of the pollsters, the advisors, the people getting paid thousands of dollars a month to advise candidates. There's a lot of money involved in all that, as you no doubt know.
I believe the
Uh,
term is called return on investment.
Return on investment. There
It's
you
only
go.
gonna be a benefit to whatever they're going to do is if it gives them something back in return. So if you have 2 people that are pitching ideas, unless you can profit the most, you're gonna choose the one you can profit the most.
And let me use another historical example to hammer home this point. I mean, one of the things I discovered, so that we have this image of corruption. The cop takes $10 to let a saloon stay open after hours. The cops allow a brothel to operate as long as they get their cut. The cops allow counterfeiters to dupe out of towners into buying fake currency as long as they get a piece of the action. Uh, you have all of that going on. What about the other side, though? These are all Democrats that I'm talking about. Well, it turns out, for example, that Thomas Platt, who was the Republican senator from New York, U.S. senator, and one of the leaders of the Republican Party, throughout the Gilded Age, early 20th century. Thomas Platt is called to testify in the early 1900s. There was a big investigation into insurance scandals. And it turns out that Platt, as leader of the Republican Party, was taking thousands and thousands of dollars from insurance companies to make sure that their taxes remained low, to make sure that there wasn't that much regulation, to make sure that they could pretty much do what they wanted in their business. Isn't that corruption? I mean, isn't that in some ways a worse kind of corruption than a cop on the beat taking $10 or somebody doing something for somebody? My point is simply that we need to get away from this myth that there's one big bad Tammany Hall Democratic Party machine, and we need to shift and understand that Republicans, the GOP, were corrupt in their own ways. And today it seems to me, as I said before, that we have a system that's fundamentally legalized bribery uh, in terms of the American political world.
When it comes to, I guess, that division aspect, is it maybe a lot of information that we might not have on the other side when it comes to some of the corruption aspects is because some of it kind of gets lost in the historical record? Like there's been a narrative that's always taught through history, whether it's the side of the winner or whatever, but there's always you get a record of it. And then it seems like today, I would say it's a little bit more balanced, only on an aspect that you might have multiple media networks that are kind of reporting and attacking the opposite side. So at least you're able to kind of come in contact with a little bit more of maybe what the other side's doing if they're just hitting home, I guess, the narrative of one. I mean, you might differ on that, but
Yeah, well, the mainstream media networks are pretty much a part of this system. I mean, I don't think it's any accident that
it's media capture.
yeah, well, I mean, this is what Trump was brilliant at, among other things. I mean, whatever you think of Trump, he was brilliant well, he was basically a TV star. I mean, that's one of the reasons people forget about this. That Trump had been very popular on The Apprentice for like 15
He was
years.
on WWE.
People knew him. That's right. And he's some kind of publicity genius, among other things. But I don't know that I think that there's this sort of long tradition that goes back to the progressive era, which I argue, in fact, begins with the Lexell investigation. The use of publicity to rouse the public conscience, the idea of if we simply show people the truth, then they will rise up and demand reform. The problem is that has become a kind of I don't know, it's almost a kind of a rote thing. In other words, I don't know that any of the media revelations that you're talking about ever make a difference, right? I mean, it's sort of like this, virtue signaling. Yes, we're concerned about this corruption. This should be looked at. Let's shine the light on this. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything's going to change. It's a very comforting narrative for a lot of reformers. The idea of if only we show people how bad things are, we can make them better. But of course, things are much more complicated than that. And the same thing holds true for the police department. Again, just speaking of New York City, Starting in the 1890s, pretty much every 20 years, there was another one of these um, sort of sensational, shocking investigations of the police department. So in 1912, there was a big investigation around the so-called Becker-Rosenthal murder, which led to a New York police captain being electrocuted for murder. 1933, the Seabury Commission looked at corruption in the cops. Samuel Seabury, a judge, held these hearings and revealed a lot of stuff. As a result, the mayor of New York, Jimmy Walker, had to resign. 1950s, you had similar investigations. 1971, you had the Knapp Commission, which was that's the thing that was made famous by Serpico and the Serpico story. In the 90s, you had the Mullen Commission, and each one of these, commissions, investigations, revelations, promises to bring about fundamental reform of the police department, but it's very, very difficult.
It's a show.
Yeah.
That's the crappy thing is they can expose a bunch of different stuff, but it's a show. I mean, I would
Doesn't need to change necessarily. Yeah.
I don't really know too much about those committee or investigations, but if you know a little bit, like I've talked to people like Jeff Shepard, who's the expert on Watergate. He defended Nixon and everything. But when you're talking about the Watergate commissions, if you look at like the church committee pulls out a heart attack gun in the middle of the thing and it's like, hey, CIA, what are you doing? And it's just like they're showing that. And then I'm like, okay, what happened? No, it was for show. That whole thing, everything that happened, they might have gotten dumbed down a little bit, but I mean, they could have ramped right back up. I know people usually bring that up when they talk about 9/11 and the CIA spying on college campuses and things of that sort.
Well, I wouldn't lump all these things together. I do disagree with you in this respect, that in the wake of Watergate, we did have some reform. In fact, the big reform that came out in 75 was what was the name of that act? It was the electoral reform. In other words, it was one of the revelations of Watergate was this tremendous amount of cash money that was flowing into the committee to re-elect the president. And so there was a law that put limits on campaign contributions. That did have some effect. Of course, now with the what was that Supreme Court decision that said that basically that money is speech. The Citizens United. That was basically Supreme Court ruled that since giving money to political campaigns is the equivalent of free speech, and you can't limit how much money people can get. So is anybody surprised that American politics has been reduced to this crazy fundraising game every year? I mean, and in terms of the church committee, it did have, I think, an effect by exposing the underside of American foreign policy in terms of trying to overthrow Castro in Cuba, CIA interventions in Guatemala, Iran, other places. And so the church committee did, I think, have a positive effect, although that didn't stop the Iran-Contra, a scandal and other things that have happened since then. So
it's mostly that covert action that I was hinting out that the church committee couldn't pull down. That still keeps on going. I think that's the main importance.
right.
But I mean, what do we do? The public sees it, but even today, our attention spans are so quick to hop on to the next thing. Even if we do say something, if it's just for show, if it's the media just showing, hey, there's this corruption or there's this, what gets done about it? It's like trying to follow through with it. It's like the major problem. You can address infinity problems, but if you're not taking care of one and actually following through with it, then what do? We're just knocking on a door and walking away.
Well, remember, it's a nation of 330 million people, a lot of people, a lot of different viewpoints. And as in the Gilded Age, the national political scene is very, very tightly contested. I mean, the Democrats and Republicans are both strong. They both have their followers. And it turns out it's very difficult to come to a consensus these days on almost anything. And I would, I would say as well that the emergence of social media, everybody now is a potential media producer, creating content, podcasts, Twitter, all this different stuff. Everybody's got a microphone now, just like you. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing.
I'm trying to do good with it.
Right. And, the other thing to remember, Robbie, is this, that look, you're a thoughtful, intelligent guy, well-educated, pretty well read, I imagine. And all of us, we have to be careful not to assume that everybody acts according to what's reasonable, what's rational, what's logical, where the evidence is. If the 20th century taught anything, it was the limits of rationality, the limits of logic, the limits of evidence. It turns out that a lot of people, act on the irrational. They do things that are not based on evidence and logic.
Well, it's anything with kids. It's anything that is something that is like emotionally, instinctually ingrained into us that causes people to snap. And sometimes I think even with today, there's people that just hear certain things that they want to hear, then they tend to freak out over it.
Well, yeah, but it's a very divided nation. But my larger point is that, again, like I said before, the progressive era sort of model was that all you have to do is show people the way things really are, show them the evidence, give them reasons to rise up, to appeal to their conscience. And I don't think that model works. I don't. I think the assumption that just because people see the evidence or whatever that they're going to change, it's not there. I mean, the Trump phenomenon proves that as well as anything, right? I mean, you and I might sit here and say, "Oh, look, this proves this proves that, this proves this." A lot of people don't give a shit, and that's certainly true about racial prejudice. It's true about anti-Semitism. When you have people like who's that Congresswoman? Was it Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about Jewish lasers from outer space are affecting voting machines? I mean, what the fuck are we talking about here? No?
I'm so happy I've been
How do
out
you
of the
how do you
more
argue? How do you argue with that? You can't argue.
I've been so happy I've been out of like the more I've been stuck strictly on like the Kennedy Johnson administration and a little bit with Nixon. But I mean, it's that reform idea that trying to show somebody that there's this corruption will make you want to stand up and do something about it. I mean, it's with best intentions that, people would want to do something, but I think that would have been way easier back in the 20s or back in a time when people had absolute 100% trust in their government. I don't trust my government at all. I don't care who's leading it. I just think that if you're more than happy to slip into the system, if you don't do the things that they want you to do, whether that's, I don't care, you can rattle off a whole list of it. But it's about that kind of this idea that like, what do we show now? I showed a heart attack gun on air. I showed a exploding seashell with Castro, shit that would just make your mind go, what? But nobody gives it's interesting for people. They might like the video. That's not what I want. I want you to be like, you see this? Like, obviously there's things you can trust, but this idea of like, hey, have 100% faith in us when we make a decision. It's like, I don't have any reason to give you my faith.
Well, listen, you're not the first generation to believe this. Listen, I grew up in the '60s. I was very involved in the anti-war movement, SDS, a bunch of other lefty things. I'm proud of that. But Vietnam was really a turning point because of what we call the credibility gap, right? I mean, you'd see Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara or Secretary of State Dean Rusk or LBJ or one of these guys get up there and insist that this is the way things are going. There's light at the end of the tunnel. We're winning the war. And then you'd read the journalism of people like David Halberstam and others, Francis Fitzgerald and many others, and you say, "Hey, this is bullshit." They're not telling the truth about Vietnam, and that was the cause of a tremendous amount of cynicism and distrust of the government. I think Watergate added to that a few years later. But I can promise you that if you go back any time in U.S. history, you're not going to find any period where everybody agrees that the government is telling the truth, or you don't have people who are deeply suspicious. And of course, the electorate has changed too. Remember, in the 1890s, women can't vote. Black people are largely disenfranchised. But even today, roughly half of Americans don't vote. I mean, that's the other thing that's sort of shocking. I was it's shocking to many people. I was thinking about this law in Australia. Imagine if we had this law in the United States. In Australia, if you don't vote, you're fined. You have to pay a fine, and so they basically insist that people vote. Now, in the United States, that would never come pass here. People infringement of my freedom, all this sort of stuff. But the larger point here is that a lot of Americans simply opt out of politics. And that's an issue too. And I think that to a great extent has to do with people's sense of it doesn't make any difference, especially poor people, minorities, a lot of working class people. People figure, it doesn't really matter. Why should I bother to vote? And that's unfortunate, of course.
Well, I'm one of those people. I think you look at it, it's a show to me that the elections, it's a debate, it's an argument back and forth. There's no
But
actually
elections
talking.
do have consequences. And if Trump had been reelected in 2020, I mean, uh, elections do have consequences, and it may not affect you that much. It may not affect me that much personally, but it does affect a lot of people. I'll give you an example of an issue like this. I remember when Bush was reelected in 2004. Got up there at the State of the Union address and started talking about what he was going to do. He was going to spend his political capital, and one of the first things he talked about was the need to privatize Social Security. How'd that go? I mean, you're not going to be able to privatize Social Security, at least not now. Elections have consequences for civil rights. They have consequences for abortion rights, reproductive rights. I mean, so even though it may not affect you and me that much, I do think it's important to vote. Although, I mean, I'm always holding my nose. I'm always feeling like it's the lesser of two evils. I
Well, what,
don't feel like
when
I'm
it comes
represented. Yeah, go ahead.
when it comes down to we mentioned left and right. Why I bring up the opinion? Why don't you just vote independent? That's what I don't get is the fact that if you ask someone who they voted for, they either say right or left, and if you say independent, they just laugh and go, "That'll never win." So that's where my whole thing is. My family, my dad mostly was like, vote independent if you're ever going to vote. I just stopped caring because that response became this aspect of like they're never going to win. Well, I
Well,
mean, so
what
you're
you're
looking.
really getting at. Sorry, go ahead.
Obviously, so you're boiling it down to a two-party system, and then it's like it's either this, everyone expects their guy to be the one that changes everything, and it doesn't happen like they want it, and they get mad at that person. They think the other side's going to be the answer or something of that sort. It's this back and forth, and to me, that's just ridiculous. I think if you're going to, I mean, one person leading a nation is
I
ridiculous,
mean,
but
part of what you're getting at, Robbie, is why are there only two parties, and why have third parties always been a failure in the United States? And that goes back to you go back to look at the Constitution. It says nothing about voting. You won't find the word voting in the Constitution. It was understood to be a local issue. But look at what we have now. I mean, 50 states. Each state has got, scores and scores of counties. Each county has got its own way of counting the ballots. I mean, just a few weeks ago after the election, I mean, how long did it take to count the ballots in Arizona? How about Brazil? They had an election, and the next day they knew the outcome. The United States has this sclerotic, creaky system, which is based on local control, and it means that and with the Trump people, this constant denial of the results, and that's good. That makes people even more cynical. Well, it doesn't matter because the election's rigged, or it doesn't matter because my guy is never going to get in because they're going to keep him out. And so it's not a very democratic system. You know,
well, that's been our
the
whole society has been people having existential crises or feeling like there's something in their way. And for rightfully so that there is that. I mean, if I could only give examples probably of the 60s and 70s, because that's what I've been focused into. But I mean, invasion into the Black Panther Party, invasion into Hollywood, strictly J. Edgar Hoover's moves with his FBI. I mean, you start feeling like, okay, wait, so it's all kind of rigged. It's called kind of setting you up to fail. And that's where people feel like it is today. I mean, my first suggestion would just be if we have any police governments or any whatever departments out there, education systems, they shouldn't be getting funding from the government. They should have their own private funding that has no government ties to it. So there's no influence or kowtowing just to get some more money. And I think that's with our medical industry as well, too.
Oh, you're talking about a political revolution. I mean, listen. If it was up to me, look, in Great Britain, they have a parliamentary system, and much of Europe, Israel, many other countries do, in which you're voting not just for a candidate but for a party, right? And you have proportional representation. In the United States, we have a winner-take-all system, right? Every congressional seat, every governorship, every senator, it's winner take all. And the Democratic Party and the Republican Party around the turn of the 20th century became legally ensconced entities. It became extremely difficult for a third party to run. That was partly because they were worried about the emergence of populism, of socialist parties. I mean, if you want to run for governor of New York State, you have to get 5,000 signatures of voters from every one of the 40 odd congressional districts. How can you do that? Let's say you're an independent candidate. You got a lot of great ideas. You're young. You're charismatic. You want. How the hell are you going to get 5,000 signatures in every congressional district in New York State in order to make your campaign viable? The answer is
Some
you
dead people are going to have to sign.
you cannot do it unless you have a political organization behind you. The most successful recent third party candidate was Ross Perot, right? Who in 1992 received 19% of the vote. That's why Bill Clinton got elected. There's no doubt in my mind that Ross Perot took more votes away from George Bush than from the Democrats and from Clinton. But Ross Perot was just one guy who wrote a big check, and there was no follow up. The Reform Party fizzled. It's very, very difficult to create a third party or a fourth party or a fifth party because of the way American election rules are set up to privilege the Democratic and Republican Party. And so even if you want to vote independent, like your old man or you, there are no independent candidates, no viable ones anyway.
Why is that so dangerous to the system?
That is the system. It's not dangerous to the system. That is the system. That has been the system since the beginning of the Republic. And the idea of, remember, it's an 18th century document, and they didn't anticipate a lot. But I mean, the Constitution, as is written, privileges the South as a region because of the 3/5 clause, which allowed them to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for population purposes, so that the South had more representatives in Congress than it should have had, because the idea they counted slaves as part of the population. The Constitution privileges small states over big states because of the Senate, right? It privileges rural areas over urban areas. I mean, this is structural. This is baked in, is what I'm telling you, Rob. I mean, how are we ever going to have a serious urban policy in this country when you have, Wyoming, North Dakota, Montana, Utah, all those small states? They have the same representation as California or Illinois or New York or Florida, right? And there's a deep anti-urban bias, these days I'm very pessimistic about that being overcome. Right? I would say this, and again, think about this in terms of the long view of American political history. The only two times that the Democratic Party has had what you call supermajorities in the House and the Senate that allows the veto proof, right? The only two times in American history we had Democratic Party supermajorities and also Democratic president happened twice. Happened in the 1930s. We had FDR and heavily Democratic Congress, and it happened in the 60s. In both of those instances, the main reason the Democrats were able to create these supermajorities and actually do things that were pretty radical was because of some kind of, in the case of the 30s, economic depression, the worst economic disaster in American history. And in the 60s, it was riding the wave of the civil rights struggle, right? The social movement for African-American equality. In the 30s, the Democrats were able to push through Social Security, unemployment insurance, the Wagner Act, which made joining a union legal, abolishing child labor. There's all this stuff they were able to do because they were trying to address a real crisis. And you had social movements, especially on the left, who were pushing for, capitalism is not working, we need something else. And in the 60s, you had a similar situation being driven by the civil rights struggle. You got Medicare, you got the Civil Rights Act,
Got JFK.
All this stuff. And, today, I keep wishing the Democrats would make a more historical argument, in their campaigns. Why not show a video of Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater, all these Republicans, 1964, 65 said, Medicare is going to destroy the nation, right? I mean, how many Republicans supported Social Security? They're still trying to repeal it, right? Again, so I think it's very rare in American history that you have a political alignment that allows you to make serious structural improvements and changes. You see what I'm getting at? Today, we have divided government. The Republicans are going to control the House, Democrats have the Senate and Biden. I promise you, you're going to get really sick of Jim Jordan if you're not already, who's going to be the chair of the Judiciary Committee. He's one of the real hard right MAGA Republicans. You thought Benghazi was bad. Where do you see the shit that's going to go down now? They're going to kind of investigate, embarrass the Democrats, but nothing is really getting done, right? And from my view, the Republicans, especially in recent years, they have no solutions. They have no ideas. Where is their alternative to Obamacare that they keep trashing? What do they want to do about immigration? What do they want to do about growing economic inequality? Nothing, basically. What they want to do is raise more money for their campaigns, appeal to rich people. The Republicans have one basic idea: cut taxes on rich people. I mean, this is all they talk about. So until the Democrats can get their act together, or unless there's some kind of economic or environmental catastrophe that reminds people that we need a federal government, it's going to continue like this. We're going to have kind of a gridlock, I think.
Did you did you look into the Depression era when the capitalist system or the model kind of seemed like it wasn't going to be the one that we were going to go with? It seemed like it failed. Did you now is that a moment where there actually would have been a different thing than what we have today in an aspect of like the first time we didn't have this like political back and forth between two different sides? I mean, if we were really I think people were at their lows. I mean, I would even bring up organized crime. I mean, we saw Al Capone feeding people soup. I mean, if you have people that are already kind of doubting their departments and doubting their government in general, and then you have the mafia coming in that is saving face in some aspect, I mean, you have people bringing their loyalty to someone else, which is dangerous for the government, which to them maybe seems like, hey, I got to get my act together. But learning more about organized crime. I started to understand is the story is always pitched as a hero and then a villain, and then you kind of learn like they not only work together in some aspects, but they also kind of have this like back and forth where it's only them that can't do things.
Well, I would not overstate the role of organized crime in giving people soup kitchens and charity. I think that's been, I mean, Al Capone, for his own purposes, would do these things as, well, see, I'm helping people and all this other stuff. The real issue there was prohibition. That's something different. I mean,
It's like El Chapo. He built a soccer stadium for people, but he was not a good guy.
it's good, or it's like Rockefeller creating a Rockefeller Foundation, or what's the latest version of this? This guy Sam Bankman-Fried. Right? We're gonna have what do they call it? Um, they have a term for a certain type of charity, a certain type of philanthropy that they want to use. Efficient giving or something like that. It's basically a way to create good publicity.
It's called insider trading.
Yeah, it's no accident that all the robber barons, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, they all created these foundations to basically whitewash, what they were actually doing. But the point about the 30s is well taken. You had the worst crisis in history of world capitalism. The Great Depression is not just America; it's all over the world, and it pushed a lot of Americans to question capitalism. You had the emergence of a powerful labor movement for the first time in American history with the CIO organizing. You had the emergence of an influential communist party, although it had a small number of people, it was very influential in pushing for labor rights, rights for African Americans, and so on. But because we have this two-party system, basically, I think the impact of that in the 30s was to push the Democratic Party to the left, which is what happened. People talk about FDR gave us this, FDR gave us that. Let me tell you, man, there were many thousands of people in the street, on picket lines, protesting, demanding things like Social Security, demanding things like the Wagner Act, demanding a minimum wage. And so I saw something similar in the 60s. As I said before, you had the civil rights movement pushing the Democratic Party, which historically had been the party of Jim Crow, the Solid South, right? The Democrats have been suppressing the black vote for generations. But the civil rights movement forced the Democratic Party to change. And as LBJ correctly predicted when he signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, we've just given the South to the Republicans, which is exactly what happened. The South is now the stronghold of the Republican Party, where it used to be the stronghold of the Democratic Party. My larger point here, Robbie, is that I consider myself I'm on the left. I'm a radical. I have been all my life. My parents were too. The best you can hope for is not an overthrow of the government. It's the pushing of the Democratic Party to be a more progressive institution. That's why I supported Bernie Sanders. The other thing about the Sanders campaign that I think was important was that it showed that you did not have to rely upon corporate giving and rich people to fund your campaign. The Sanders campaign raised $200 or $300 million from people giving $50, $100, $25, whatever. Now Bernie lost, and I don't think he's going to run again. But I don't think anybody would argue with the fact that Bernie Sanders moved the Democratic Party to the left in terms of $15 an hour minimum wage, in terms of demanding reproductive rights for women, in terms of a lot of things that many elected Democrats didn't really care about. Sanders showed the power of grassroots organizing to move the party in the way I think it needs to move. Anyway, I don't want to ramble on here, so
Well, no,
jump right in.
I think you're right. I think it's how the game is played. If one side starts to change the game, the other side tries to continue playing that game, and then they change a little bit as well, and then they get lost from the main point. I think Bernie Sanders trying to kind of steer in the left a little bit. He could have done that. I mean, it was yet to be seen because I feel like they attacked him, or they all alt-right, I guess, squashed him. Not the alt-right. I meant like they alternatively both of them kind of squashed, and then
But have you noticed? But here's something that's relevant to this, and I'm teaching and writing. I've done a lot on the Cold War and anti-communism in American
let's
life.
talk about the 60s and 70s. I'm all in.
Well, I mean, I'm talking about the 50s too, but I mean, you know what the term red baiting means, right?
Yes.
All right. So in the 40s, in the 50s, there was a tremendous amount of red baiting in American politics, the tarring of people claiming they were communist influenced, or communist sympathizers, fellow travelers, all these terms. And of course, there was a Soviet Union, there was a China. You had McCarthy and other people who were claiming that the American government was, infested with spies and all this. Anti-communism was a popular movement. Don't ever think that McCarthy shoved it down people's throats. But here's the thing. All this talk about bipartisanship, we need to be bipartisan, we need bipartisanship. I think that was largely a function of the Cold War. And once the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, isn't it interesting that 1994 was the moment when the Republicans took back the House, Newt Gingrich, contract with America, and all of a sudden bipartisanship is not so much, And here we are in the 21st century, in 2022. The Soviet Union has been gone for over 30 years. There is more red baiting now by the Republican Party, not just Trump, than there ever was in the 50s. Basically, any moderate Democrat is a radical, a Marxist, a socialist. I mean, you claim that people like Chuck Schumer or Obama are somehow Marxist, they're radicals, they want to. It's bogus, man. It's just not true. But this is another way of reminding you, as I remind everybody that I know, that Trump was not the cause, he was the symptom. And that part of Trump's power and his ability to get elected president is because he was able to tap into very, very deep currents in American culture and politics. Racism, homophobia, misogyny, nativism, jingoism, anti-immigrant stuff. I mean, these are very deep currents in American history. And too many people thought, oh, that's all behind us. We solved those problems in the 60s. I don't think we did. I think that the overturning of Roe v. Wade is maybe the best or the worst example of all this, right? You've had this thing, for 50 years as a result of the women's movement and so on. By the way, did you know that in 1972, the Republican platform endorsed the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment? and reproductive rights. Can you imagine that today? Right? So Trump and his people have been very, very effective in tapping into some of the worst aspects of American history and culture, and basically, they've got 40% of the population. About 40% of the population believes all this stuff.
You think a largely amount of that tapping into that roots of our culture was also an aspect that we always have a Christian family man as being our president, and we all know it's BS. I
Oh, I
mean,
don't think it's I don't think it's that simple. I think you've got. I would sort of amend that to suggest that what you've got is a very, very large number of Americans who identify as evangelical Christians. It's got nothing to do with who the president is. Um,
I would say it's like the movie Idiocracy where Terry Crews was president and they were washing the crops with Gatorade. It was that idea that it's a celebrity that they put as president. I mean, people still say that today, but the fact is that hurts, or I'm not even say it hurts me. It's just it's upsetting to see is that they don't let it go. It's that bringing back of Trump, every mention in the media is Trump. It's like, you got to fucking move forward, or we're just going to be reiterating the past for another 20, 30 years. And then what happens? We just get lost in time.
but the problem I have is with your use of the term "we." Who are we talking about? We. I mean, this is one of the things that bothers me about mainstream news. I watch CNN, I watch MSNBC, I watch the rest of them, and there's always this thing about if we could only move toward the middle. If only we could all get together and move toward the middle. And it's a denial of the fact that there's a lot of people who don't want to be in the middle, particularly people on the right. And I mean, are you going to, have you ever tried arguing with a Trump supporter?
I have a couple of friends that are Trump support. I have friends from all different political
Okay, fair
spectrums.
enough. But it's beyond argument. And a lot of people are not going to cop to the fact that they hate black people, or they hate immigrants, or they don't like Jews, or whatever, or they don't, whatever. I think to some extent, to get back to your interest in the 60s and 70s, we are seeing a kind of backlash, long-term backlash against women's rights, against civil rights for minorities, against the youth culture, the anti-war movement. There are a lot of people that are still sort of convinced that all of that stuff is wrong, right? And the right now controls the Supreme Court. They've got the House. I don't. Everybody says Trump is dead. I don't know. Let's see somebody beat him in a primary
I would
first.
feel like that wouldn't be just right. I feel like that would be more conservative. It seems like there's a large amount of people out there that just want it to be the exact same of like a time when there was what the way they liked it, not this esha of moving forward as well.
Change is hard. Let me give you another interesting parallel for you to mull over. So if you look at the 10 years after World War One, basically the 20s, right? You've got an entirely new cultural universe that's been created in just a few years. Hollywood motion pictures, radio broadcasting, tabloid newspapers, the phonograph and recording industry, modern advertising and marketing. All of these things happen pretty much at the same time, and tremendous disruption of what people think of as normal. Right? Warren Harding gets elected president in 1920 on the slogan "Return to normalcy." Can we go back to the way things were before World War One? Of course, there was no going back. But it's no accident, in my mind, that you have this tremendous cultural upheaval. At the same time, the 20s is a very conservative period politically. Republicans control the presidency and the Congress. Immigration restriction comes in 1924. The revival of the KKK in the 20s. Prohibition, telling people you can't drink. You have all of these, the emergence of evangelical Christianity as a force in the 20s. So, in some respects, I think when people feel that there's a lot of cultural change, a lot of people feel uncomfortable, especially older people. That's going to make them move to become more conservative as a way to sort of, ward off all these new things.
Well, it's that weird tie-in with politics and religion that I started to realize. I mean, you can look at it as from a purist aspect. I mean, Hoover is my best example because Hoover invaded Hollywood looking for communists. Everything got labeled with the communist brush. Even Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged killer of the president. And the reason why I say that is because I've spoken with plenty of JFK researchers and also Robert Blakey from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the second investigation into the whole JFK thing. And he admitted Oswald was intelligence, first time in 60 years. And that's still in the history books. Oswald is this lonely, crazy nut person. I got documents to back up the thing that I say that he's not. And it's that whole aspect. You have one guy, Hoover, seen as a purist. I've talked to both sides, people that hate him and people that love him. I don't really know the man, so I couldn't give you a fair depiction of it. But it's the same thing. You look into the JFK assassination. The conservatives are the people who say it's the official story. Liberals are the ones that say that there's conspiracy. Okay, well, let's look at the facts of the case. It's not boiling it down. It immediately gets put into sides. That person's alt-right, or that person's left, or that person's this. Where's the conversation just doesn't boil down past that. You got to move past that on anything.
Right, but as an historian, I believe you got to look at the evidence and you've got to be critical of your sources. The single best book on the JFK assassination, in my view, was called "A Cruel and Shocking Act." I'm blanking on the name of the author. He was a New York Times reporter. A Cruel and Shocking Act. It's a history of the Warren Commission. You should check it out. It's a great book.
I've been sent that name before. Hold on. I think I
A
might.
Cruel and Shocking Act. Let me just check
I've
the.
talked to like everybody on the JFK assassination.
I in 2013, I did a number of interviews, media interviews about JFK. You can find them on the web. People want to know, what do you think about,
Like I've spoke to Posner and he's not on my side, but
no,
there's
he's not.
there's a few things that in the House Select Committee on Assassinations was able to prove. And that's not never mind, not the same book. I was looking at a higher form of killing.
Let me just give you the name of this guy. Cruel and Shocking. Yes, Philip Sheenon. This is, I have no interest in all those conspiracy theories, to be honest, because what they do is they become an avoidance of real politics and real history. I don't know that we're ever going to know what actually happened. From my way of thinking, what's much more interesting and much more important is the evolution, the development of JFK's presidency. So here's a guy who in 1960, when he's debating Nixon, try to out Cold War Nixon. He was, a militant Cold Warrior. We had the Bay of Pigs disaster, which could have been avoided. And we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a direct consequence of that. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK was chastened. He became much less of a Cold Warrior. He began to see the importance of nuclear weapons treaty, which he signed in the summer of '63. He created a hotline with Moscow. He began to distrust a lot of his more hardline advisors. So my point is that JFK evolved. Same thing with civil rights. In 1960, JFK was not a proponent of civil rights. His people were all worried they were going to lose the South. They were very, very,
Well, that's why they had LBJ on the ticket. I mean, if you look at his debates with Nixon, he was talking about that a white baby in this country gets a way better education than a black baby in this country. They're revolutionary things, but that doesn't fit the whole government
But
system.
it's really, but what really changes JFK is the civil rights movement. He is forced to change his views because of the Freedom Rides, because of James Meredith integrating University of Mississippi, because of George Wallace. He was forced to use federal power, right, to enforce the Constitution. That's really what the civil rights movement was all about. My only point here is that JFK in 1960 is a very different guy than he was in 1963 because of the force of events and because, like some presidents, not all, he grew in office. Right? To me, that's much more interesting and much more. You can show things with the conspiracy stuff. I mean, it's an avoidance of all that. I mean, really, you're never going to know. You got all these people with these crazy theories. I mean, it's not history. It's something else. It's fantasy.
Well, that's why I spoke to John Thunheim of the AARB of the Assassination Records Review Board. I'm sticking with what we know now through documents. That's all I'm trying to do is teach a better historical record. But when you say when he experienced change, I mean, Kennedy ran it on the platform of a Cold Warrior, but I mean, he was also the one that signed a check to Tom Oboya, and Tom Oboya was a guy that I think it was a check for, I think it would have been $100,000 in today's time, maybe a little bit more. And it was to bring over one person from Africa. I forgot if it was each one of the small towns that they had to go to some of these colleges and become educated, because Tom Oboya wrote a note to him or wrote a letter and said, hey, we have nobody in this country that's educated. How do you expect us to build back up our country? JFK did that. And he also met with private advisors from other Latin America countries as well, too. And his own meetings. No president before that has ever done that or really ever done it afterwards. Johnson took a lot of stuff that was Kennedy's and just kind of signed it and kind of went with it. But Kennedy was talking about a lot of great things. I mean, it was left to see what was going to happen, but he took the rap for the Bay of Pigs. And in my opinion, that's a good thing that what he did. I mean, it was the CIA, it was Eisenhower's baby, but Kennedy took it and he took full responsibility. He says, I'm in charge of these institutions. I take full responsibility for the Bay of Pigs. But I mean, you can back and forth. You can say conspiracy is the aspect to declare war on some of the people that ended up screwing us over. But he did fire a couple of people. Alan
Yeah,
Dulles
no,
being
he definitely did, and he began to rethink his whole view on U.S. Soviet relations. And nothing like. I mean, listen, I was a kid in 1962. I was 11 years old, and I thought it was going to be all over. I was very scared that there was going to be a nuclear war that October because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think the larger point is sometimes we tend to overstate what presidents or any politicians can and can't do. And I think it's always important to be looking at not just the people in office, but what's happening outside of office, and particularly in the realm of social movements. There's no more important domestic social movement than the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s in terms of really changing the society. On the other hand, I have students all the time say, well, we still have racism. It didn't really do. Yeah, of course we do. But if you think that America is the same now as it was in 1960, you're just, you're just ignorant. And one of my pleas is that, especially for younger folks, um, do some reading, man. Don't rely on Twitter and TikTok and all of this shit. There's some great history out there. And yeah, you got to sit down and read the goddamn book. But that's how you educate yourself, and that's how you're able to learn about what this country has been.
most of my listeners are probably like 30 to 45. But my whole thing is I even tell people don't if I say something on here or a guest says something on here, look it up for yourself and trying to find that out as well too. But I mean, there's a lot of things we don't know. Like a lot of people don't know what COINTELPRO is. Like that's something I mean, my listeners would probably know what it is, but the average person my age doesn't know what that is, doesn't know that and that's a really big issue, but that's kind of like where I fall like with the JFK stuff. It's all I got to see that there is documents to back up whatever that point is. There's a lot of conspiracies out there and it really sucks. It's people that profit off of it and all that and it makes it really really hard. But when you look into who he was, I looked into his past, I looked into his life, I looked into the speeches and I've dozens of hours of speeches that he has and you start getting a better respect for the person. Now, I'm still not a Kennedy, fanboy like a lot of people are. I look at him like he was going to do great things, but then you kind of start looking at, okay, what happens afterwards? And look at the people that had this person come up on TV and let them all know all these things. He talked about America not being a generation that 2 decades ago could recognize itself. He said we've lost in everything in the field of science. He's talking about space being science, and it's just like who's ever openly said that on TV besides in a movie, like where someone has openly criticized, and it's always got to be this America's great, America's fantastic, America's this. And I think, people needed something like that.
Yeah, although Kennedy was also responsible for getting us into Vietnam. I know there's this debate about he was really wanted to get us out, although there's no evidence of that. I think that one of the problems with Kennedy in retrospect now is that this is really he really upped the ante of political celebrity. The sort of the confusion or the blending of politics and celebrity. We live in a really celebrity driven culture, and JFK is the first TV president. He was young, he was good looking, he was fucking every woman that he came in contact with. And people like all this stuff and they like reading about it. They like, Kennedy, Marilyn Monroe, all of this shit. And all I'm saying is that I think in the long run, what's most important to look at is his policy. What did he actually do? How did he change over time? You can argue the conspiracies from now to doomsday. You can't argue the point that on the day that Medgar Evers was assassinated in Mississippi, Kennedy appeared on national television and made civil rights a priority. It took LBJ to get it through, but Kennedy in June of 1963 was a much different guy than Kennedy in June of 1960. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm not saying your
I'm
stuff is
interested in that.
important.
Interested in that too. I mean, the Alliance for Peace and Progress that he was doing as well. I mean, pressuring the FDA to go after or at least be more responsible for the side effects that they do to people that use their products. I mean, that's stuff I've never heard from a
The
president
19
before.
the 1963, I forget the name of the act, but it was Kennedy appointed a commission on women that came out with a very, very interesting list of proposals, including equal pay for equal work, so on and so forth. So Kennedy was one of the first people to make women's issues important. So yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of sick of JFK at this point. I just think there's too much obsession with him, and um,
I only got obsessed because when you look into the assassination, you start seeing the names pop up with like MLK, you start seeing RFK issues, and you start seeing a lot of things. And I just know much too much about the CIA and the FBI back then, where I just go, I mean, if this is a complete injustice, I mean, if you look at the 634 assassination attempts on Castro or planned assassination attempts on Castro, each one is more nuts than the last. And you go, why are these people in our offices making decisions like
one of the
this?
great things about Philip Sheenon's book is that he doesn't claim to know who, he thinks it's Oswald, but he does say, here's what we do know. We know that the FBI had been surveilling Oswald since
For up to 4 years. Yeah.
1959, and there was a meeting in the, I think it was the summer of '63, and the big debate was, should we put Oswald on what was called a security index, which was the highest level of threat to the United States. And the discussion was had, and they said, no, we're not going to do that. Now, I can tell you from my own personal research, I've recovered a bunch of FBI files, stuff I'm working on in my family. Both my parents were communists for a long time. I had other people in my family who were in the Communist Party. Every one of my family were on the security index. I mean, these are just working class, ordinary people in New York City. They were considered to be a higher threat, the highest threat to the United States. Oswald, no. Same thing with the CIA. They had footage of Oswald in the Mexican embassy. They had all this stuff,
That
but they
wasn't him.
refused. They refused to cooperate with the Warren Commission. Why? Because they were afraid that all that stuff that was going on in Cuba was going to be revealed. So both the FBI and the CIA withheld material from the Warren Commission because
Yeah.
they were afraid it would compromise some of their stuff. So that's a fact, right?
That's
Now, that
100%.
doesn't tell us who can, but the point is that they knew who Oswald was. They had stuff on him. They didn't act on it, and they had their own bureaucratic reasons, talking about the FBI and the CIA, for not doing that.
They definitely withheld documents from the Warren Commission, but the Warren Commission was supposed to be the investigation into the president's death. But it reads more like Oswald did it, and we're going to show you how. I mean, you can't explain why there's Jack Ruby's mother's dental records that are in there. There's a document I literally have that I showed.
Let's not get into this now.
I'm just saying, there's a lot of crap in there. You can't sit there and tell me that was
but the idea that but the idea that all these researchers going down that rabbit hole are going to somehow come up with what really happened, I don't believe.
I'm not even interested in trying to solve who did it. I'm just interested in trying to figure out the events of '63 and transpiring after and before.
I would be I'm much more focused on, what happened in Vietnam and the lying.
I had Peter Kuznick from Untold History on here, and he gave a good breakdown of Vietnam. He said it was a message to Russia, which is dropping the bombs over there. I mean, there was no need to drop those extra bombs.
Yeah, but the problem also is that in all these discussions of Vietnam, I always tell people, be wary of one of the fundamental assumptions of the post-war era that many Americans have, namely that the United States can control events anywhere in the world, which of course is a hubristic, ridiculous idea. And when it turns out that there are things that we can't control, like let's say the revolution in China, or what happened in Vietnam, it must be because we have spies, we have traitors, whatever. And it's a ridiculous
It's
assumption.
business ties. That's what it is.
Well, but I mean, there's also a Vietnamese revolution. There's also Ho Chi Minh. There's also a struggle for independence. Did you know that Ho Chi Minh wrote 8 letters to President Truman in 1947, 48, looking for American help to defeat the French? And of course, the French were determined to come back and reclaim their colonial empire, which they had lost during World War II. Truman never responded to Ho Chi Minh. We never know we don't know what might have happened. But the Vietnamese saw the Americans as their ally. They figured, well, the United States had an anti-colonial war against the British. They struggled for independence. When Ho Chi Minh appeared on a hotel balcony in Hanoi in 1946 and declared the Republic of Vietnam, he started by quoting the American Declaration of Independence. All people are created equal, and so on and so forth. you cannot understand Vietnam if your only perspective is Kennedy, the Americans, LBJ. You've got to understand the politics, the culture there, and understand that the American policy in Vietnam was blinded by the Cold War. It's like a horse with blinders. We couldn't see anything except the struggle with Moscow, and they control everything. Moscow did not control the Vietnamese Revolution. They did not control these guys who were fighting in Dien Bien Phu and elsewhere. But the United States believed that no revolution, no social reform anywhere in the world was possible unless it was directed by Russia. And that's been a tremendous problem for American foreign policy ever since, in my view.
When I spoke with Greg Polgrain, he wrote a book about JFK in Indonesia, and the interesting thing he talked about Sukarno and all that. There's a document where someone just goes, wait, there's another form of communism? Because it was like the government broad brushing communism to be like, there's Russia communism that they brainwash people and like, this is horrible.
Have you read? But it wasn't just. Have you read about the CIA overthrow of the government in Guatemala in 1954? The CIA overthrow the government in Iran in 1953. If only Americans would understand that from the Iranian perspective, the United States overthrew a democratically elected government because they were worried that the American oil companies are going to lose their concessions. They were afraid that Iran, God forbid, might nationalize, their own resources. Are you familiar with the CIA interventions in all these places under the name of anti-communism, but had nothing to do with communism?
That's why I'm trying to say about the freaking what is it? The church committee and that damn covert action. That's got to be reduced, man. This idea of regime change is nuts. I mean, I get it. You can, have a debate about if Castro would have been whatever, but there's still like a lot of stuff where it's like America just needs to take a seat on the bench for a little bit. I mean, I hate to say it.
Here's a problem with that. Again, you're coming from a thoughtful, rational perspective, but here's another thoughtful, rational perspective for you to think about. I had these arguments a great deal in 2003
Are we
with friends of mine with the run-up to the war in Iraq, which I was very involved in trying to stop. We didn't do enough. But a lot of people said to me, I think Americans are being duped. They don't understand what's really happening. If only they knew the real truth. I said, I don't agree with that. I think most Americans understand that their way of life and all the things they take for granted, especially in the post-war era, that every so often you have to kick ass in the world to defend what we have. And I think most Americans are okay with that, frankly. The Cold War emphasized the idea that there's only two ways to be in the world. There's the free way, and then there's the red way. The same thing happened in Nicaragua. Any attempt at a social revolution, not necessarily communism, but land redistribution, the right to protest. In Latin America, for example, in Central America, the whole economy for the 20th century in those countries became based upon the export of what we call commodity crops. Sugar, cocoa, coffee, all that stuff. And when people start saying in some Latin American countries or Central American countries, hey, what if we organized our agriculture a different way? What if we focused on small farmers producing for themselves and the neighborhoods rather than export crops for United Fruit or whatever? That's a threat to American hegemony. Why did Reagan and all those people, insist that we had to crush the Nicaraguan revolution, the Contras, all that stuff? Because, were they worried that Nicaragua was going to, you're going to have Nicaraguan tanks rolling across Texas? No, it was not a military threat. It was an ideological threat. And that's what happens after World War II, Robbie, is that national security, starting with Truman, becomes defined ideologically, not militarily. So that any social revolution, any socialist movement, any of that kind of stuff is a threat to our hegemony. You better believe that when they overthrew the Guatemalan government in 1954, they were under pressure from United Fruit Company, which was worried that it was going to, lose control of all this land. And P.S. Alan Dulles, who was head of the CIA,
I know.
was on the board of United Fruit.
He's also in charge of MK Ultra as well too, but nobody else likes to talk about.
So
that.
you know some of the stuff. So I'm saying that
I'm agreeing with you. I don't know why you think we're disagreeing.
Only because I'm suspicious of this idea that if only Americans knew what was going on, I think most Americans would say, yeah, let's go in and kick ass. Especially after 9/11, and we've got to protect what we have. This is part of Trump's appeal too. And the crisis now is that, to a great extent, that look, there were certain basic shared beliefs, shared assumptions after World War II in American life. The economy is going to grow endlessly. Growth is good. Your kids are going to have more than you have. If you're a working class guy, working in an auto plant, you can have enough to have a house, maybe send your kid to state university, have a decent middle class life. We can control events anywhere in the world. All these assumptions are now under dispute, right? There's no going back to the world of the 50s or even 1980 for that matter. The American economy in the world is much less dominant than it used to be. Are most people confident that their kids are going to have more than they do? I don't think so. We've had the industrial base of the United States hollowed out. You can't assume anymore. And is endless growth a good thing? Well, not if you're concerned about the climate. It's not. And a lot of people have a tough time questioning or asking themselves, well, are these things really not true anymore? And that appeal is a big part of Trump's success, in my view. Let's go back to the days when America kicked ass, when white people ran things, when we didn't have to worry about minorities and pushy women. A lot of people, yeah, let's go back to that. And that's where we're at today. But there's no going back. The United States is not going to ever be the kind of hegemonic power
You don't
that it
think
was
I'm a
in the
Trumper,
50s
do
and
you?
60s. No, 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 no. I'm not saying
Okay.
this is about you. No, I don't.
The way it was like coming off was like you're thinking I'm
No,
a
no, no.
Trumper.
I'm
I've
just
had some
ranting.
people say I was a conservative. I'm like, I'm none of that. I really don't think you're not going to
I'm not
find
trying to. I'm not
corruption.
trying to pigeonhole you. No, I'm just ranting about what I see as real big changes.
You have great points. I agree with all of them. I just think with the JFK thing, thing I'm still thinking about is whenever you label it conspiracy, it's like then we can never talk about it. It's like there are real conspiracies, but I think if you look at like, especially, I mean, just the climate. I mean, I started looking all around the 60s and 70s, and the more I see the long arm of the FBI and the CIA, I start to get a little bit, curious into other aspects of things. I mean, it was shown on TV that the Black Panther Party was violent in a lot of movies. I mean, that was in Forrest Gump when they had grenades and guns. They never explained that it was just kind of like protection or for show for themselves. But then you learn about the Fred Hampton assassination, learn how they botched that. And it was like, okay, so there's a complete misjustice that was going on. And then you talk about the police corruption there, where they were pissing on people's ice cream that was being given out. I mean, that's real danger, and history's not teaching that. Nobody, you have to go find that from an independent historian or researcher, which is important that we have those. But how come our history books don't ever allude more about these things? I
Well,
mean,
they do actually. You got to read them. I mean, this is my thing.
well, I never learned this in school.
I'm not talking about you, but I mean, I can't stand this. I mean, uh, look at MLK, for example. Dr. King has become a kind of plaster saint. Every holiday we have the picture
You
of him.
smoke
I have the
cigarettes.
dream. Huh?
You smoke cigarettes.
Forget about that. I'm talking about this fantasy that King was somehow a beloved figure. He was not. He was one of the most reviled people in the United States in the 60s. And I vividly remember in 1967, I was a senior in high school in New York, going on the first big anti-war march in April of 67. King was one of the speakers, and he had come out against the war. And the shit he took from the New York Times, from other civil rights leaders, from so-called liberals. Oh, why is he getting messed up? And why is the civil rights leader talking about Vietnam? Let's separate these things. King saw that these things were related, and if you look at what happened after King, in 1966, SCLC started a campaign in Chicago, and it was an open housing campaign, and they went up there and they thought, well, let's try to do in the North what we did in the South, and they got their asses kicked. And you look at these pictures, and you look at the newsreels, white people in Chicago and the suburbs holding up KKK signs, swastikas, all of this stuff. And people said this is worse than anything we ever saw in Alabama or Mississippi. The idea that it's just a Southern problem, right? And so I say, let's look at King and what he really did. And in my view, King was a more radical figure than Malcolm X ever was, because he saw the connections between poverty at home, racism, the Vietnam War, military spending, all these things he brought together. Of course, he was assassinated, he wasn't even 40 years old. But I can't stand the way King is made into this kind of sentimental figure that he never was.
Well, it's the same thing with like Russia and everybody reporting on Russia and Ukraine right now. They talk shit on Ukraine for the longest time and then they immediately flip the other way and nobody remembers that.
It's unfortunate. I mean, I certainly don't support what the Russians are doing, but I'm suspicious. There's too many Democrats who want to see the Cold War revived, in my view, and there's going to have to be a negotiated settlement. I don't see any real outside of this, but
It's a lot of conflicting times. And I mean, that's why I'm trying to look through history, see if it's always been conflicting. And I think there's different
there's
forms of
always
it,
there's
but
there's always conflict at any moment. And see, this is why I always say to people, don't ascribe moral or political views to a time period. You know, turbulent 60s, the silent 50s, the this, the that, the me generation. At any given moment in American history, you pick any time you want. I will lay out for you how much contention there was, how much disagreement there was, how much political and cultural struggling there was. History is about conflict, and it's driven by conflict. And that's true in the United States as well as anywhere else. People always look at me and say, "Oh, I wish things were back the way they were," and so, go back to the way things were, go back to that time, and things were not the way people think they were.
can I just have a mellow fucking 2000s would be nice. Jesus. Daniel, I really appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show, man. You gave me more than enough, and I really appreciate the conversation. This is kind of what my show's about, and I enjoyed it. Is there a place where people could find your books and any other links you'd like to promote as well too?
Well, thanks for having me. First of all, I enjoyed talking with you. If they just Google Daniel Czitrom, stuff will come up. My books on. We never got to talk about Media in the American Mind, which is now 40 years old, by the
It'll
way.
be next
Uh,
time. You're
and
welcome back. You're anytime.
Yeah, and so I don't have a website. I don't. I'm not on Facebook. But there's a profile of me on the Mount Holyoke website that you can look at. It lists all my publications and shit I've done, and so on. So,
I'm gonna link all your links in the
New York
description.
Exposed is in paperback.
Show it
Very
up on
great.
screen.
Hold it up.
There we go.
It would make a great TV series. In fact, in case anybody's listening, I wrote a treatment for a TV series. I've done a lot of work in documentary films. I've been on PBS a lot. And in 2011, 2012, 13, I was the historical advisor for this BBC America dramatic series called Copper, which was on only for 2 years. It's set in New York in the 1860s about police, and I had a lot of interesting experiences working on that show. So I think it's important to bring history out of academia. History is too important to be left just to history professors. And whenever I have these conversations with people, I'm reminded that a lot of people care about history, and I encourage people to read more and dig deeper. So.
Well, I'm gonna link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.